Times. I cover housing affordability issues out of our state capitol bureau in Sacramento. And why don't we just start by having everyone introduce themselves and say what they do.
I'm Leslie Appleton-Young. I'm the chief economist of the California Association of Realtors.
I'm Peter Blanchard. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey and Company in our housing practice.
I'm Jennifer Hernandez. I'm a partner and lead up the Holland and Knight West Coast Environmental and Land Use practice. I do land use entitlement work, and I'm very active in the civil rights space around environmental and housing issues.
Greg Morrow. I'm the executive director of the UC Berkeley Real Estate Development and Design.
So how I generally like to run these panels is to try to make them as conversational as possible. So I think I'll start with a question directed at each person individually, and then hopefully some of the later questions we can have more of a debate or conversation. So Peter, I want to start with you. One of Governor Gavin Newsom's key promises on housing is calling for the building of 3.5 million new homes between now and 2025. And for context, that would more than quadruple the current annual production rate for a 7-year period. But not many people know that number comes from a McKinsey report that was authored in 2016. And so I was hoping you could maybe take us through how that number came about.
Certainly. So the report you're referring to is Closing California's Housing Gap. The aspiration for that report was firstly to quantify the gap. And what we meant by gap in that instance is twofold. One, understanding the affordability issues in the state, which I think are clear to probably most people here. But for example, in LA, we find that 67%, a full 2/3 of the city, cannot afford the cost of living. And by affordability there, we define that as 30% of your income going to your housing, whether that's either rent or paying mortgage payments. The second piece we looked at was, well, what is the right amount of housing for the state to have? Because as we know, looking backwards, the rate of population growth has significantly exceeded the rate of growth of stock of housing. And that dislocation has created a gap that we were trying to quantify. One of the ways we did that was just looking at peer states. I know there's no peer for California, but trying to get a sense of what the ratio of numbers of units to numbers of residents of states were, and look at what a reasonable benchmark would be to target for a ratio for California. And what we found by looking at that benchmark is over the next 10 years, this report was, most of the work was done in 2015. So by 2025, given the rate of growth projected of California, given the existing gap of around 2 million units and a projected gap based on construction rates, we'd see about 3.5 million units needed to catch up to a benchmark ratio. So that was the aspiration of the initial portion of that report, which is quantifying the gap. The second piece, which is I think really the meat of it, we'll talk about some of it, and we already heard some of it from Chuck, but it's what do we do about it? So what is the toolkit to actually address this, both at the local level, but also at the state level? And I won't get into it now, but I'm sure some of the topics will come up as we discuss further.
I am just curious, so did you think that there was going to be a gubernatorial candidate who was going to basically take that report whole stock and use it as part of his platform?
That was the dream, perhaps, but I don't think it was the expectation. Yeah.
Greg, I want to turn next to you. So you've done a lot of research on how the zone capacity in Los Angeles has changed over the years. And can you talk about what you found and what that has meant for how LA has grown and how it could grow in the future?
Right, yeah. I mean, I was really concerned about why our housing production has declined so badly. And so LA was sort of a microcosm of the state, if you will. So it's kind of a historical evaluation of why, or what actually happened, first of all. And what happened is that we massively downzoned the city from a capacity of roughly 10 million people in the 1960s. If you added up all of the zoning in the city, that's sort of what the capacity of the city would be. And over a period of about a decade, in the 70s, when we initiated the community planning process, we reduced that down to about 4 million. And so there was kind of a two-step process. One where we had a huge amount of downzoning, and that was not, it was not a debate. It wasn't a debate about whether we do it. It was a debate about how much we did it. And it was called rollbacks. That's kind of how it was termed. But what's also happened in the subsequent decades, in the 80s and 90s, is the pace at which we've allowed new growth has been much less than what the growth that we've actually seen. So we essentially didn't plan for enough growth. So if you look at if you add up all of the 35 community plans in Los Angeles, and that's the other thing to realize, is that it's planned like 35 cities that are kind of separately. And you add up all the amount of growth that was allowed from 1970 to today, it would allow for an additional population of about 380,000. What we got was 1,080,000. And so we have literally had 700,000 people's worth of growth. It's kind of weird to talk about the zoning capacity in that way, but that's kind of what it is. It gives you a sense that what's happened is we simply have not allowed housing units to be built. And it goes to, in some ways, what Chuck was talking about, the incrementalism. Well, we've done the incrementalism in reverse. It's been a kind of death by 1,000 cuts. So if you look at places in Hollywood, which has very good transit access, we've gone from areas that are, a block, 2 blocks from transit, that have gone from R4 zoning, which is sort of high density, in the first plan, in the 1970s Hollywood plan. In the next iteration of that community plan, we've cut that density in half. And then in the latest one, we've cut it down to RD 1.5, which is basically a half again. So over the course of 30 years, we basically cut out by 4 times the amount of density that's allowed. And it's just an example, but this is happening all across the city. And what it ends up being is a situation where suddenly there's not enough development capacity for the process that Chuck outlined for there to be that incremental development and redevelopment growth. And so what happens is the only way we can grow is through these very heavy-handed approaches where we're going to put all the density in one place because that's the only way politically we can get away with it all around these massive transit areas. And of course, that's type 1 construction, concrete construction, extremely expensive. So we end up producing units that are extremely expensive. And yes, we set aside a few of them, but for low income, but at the end of the day, we're overproducing luxury units and underproducing affordable units. So that's kind of the pattern that we've seen historically.
And can you just quickly explain some of the nuts and bolts of when you're reducing zone capacity, that makes it harder to build outside of that zoning, that zoning range, because if you want to build 2 units on a site that says you can only build 1, you have to go through a lot of hoops to.
Well, exactly. And so most developers are not going to want to go through that process. And we can kind of talk about CEQA, we can talk about Prop 13 and all of the influences that all of these things have. But essentially what we've done in order to make up for the fact that our plans don't actually allow for growth is a whole bunch of exceptions. And and that's where the kind of ballot measures that were in place a couple years ago about, do we not allow these kind of exceptions to take place, because that's essentially what the city council wants to do, is to control the ability to approve these large-scale projects in their districts. And so that ends up being the only way that you can actually start to get some of these things to happen. What should happen is the community plans should allow for what Chuck has talked about, is the incremental growth over time. And that's the only way that you're really going to get this kind of durable issue.
Jennifer, you've taken a special interest in the California Environmental Quality Act. That's the 1970 law, for those unfamiliar, that requires developers to disclose and attempt to minimize their project's effects on the environment, but in practice it means much more than that. And so, Jennifer, I want to talk specifically about what you've learned about the law's effects on urban development in particular.
Yes, thanks, Liam, and thanks to everyone. What a beautiful location and facility. So just as sort of the rise of civil rights laws were taking effect in the early 70s, so too was a very strong environmental ethic, and California is a leader on environmental protection and always has been. And so this law, the California Environmental Quality Act, was adopted to really protect people from government decisions that would allow adverse impacts on the environment. And at the time, we were worried about deforestation, we were worried about freeways through the heart of San Francisco, we were worried in a big way about pollution and about protection of natural resources like the Kings Canyon, which Disney proposed for development. So in its way and in its time, which Governor Reagan signed into law in a very brief and bipartisan law, CEQA was about protecting what we now think of as the environment, but then it was given over to the lawyers and to the judges who were once lawyers. And lawyers can create a fair amount of mischief and bill a lot of hours. And in the intervening nearly now 50 years of CEQA's history, what constitutes an environmental effect has been ever expanding. And so, for example, it's not just aesthetics, not sure what that means, but it's also private views are protected under CEQA. And by protected under CEQA, it means change is considered an adverse impact. And there's about 30 different categories and over 100 different impacts that have evolved over time as things that need to be addressed under CEQA, and it's not a closed loop set. Judges continue to recognize new impacts. What this has meant in practice is that urbanized development, which affects more people, especially more people in wealthier areas, has been very easy to target in CEQA litigation. CEQA litigation outcomes are notoriously unpredictable. Nearly 50% of CEQA lawsuits win, which imagine if the IRS lost 50% of its tax cases, what our tax system would be like. CEQA is very randomized in terms of outcome. And with respect to housing and infill housing in particular, we've done now 3 sets of studies that focus on all CEQA lawsuits filed statewide, but in the SCAG region, the biggest and most populous region in California, Southern California Association of Governments region, which includes all San Diego, or all Southern California counties except San Diego, we found over a 3-year period after the recession, 14,000 housing units were challenged. 98% of those housing units were in urbanized infill locations. 70% of the challenged housing units were within half a mile of high-quality transit, as the SCAG region has defined them. And by far the majority, 78% of the challenged housing units were in whiter, wealthier, and healthier parts of the region. The profile of CEQA as a tool against infill development is hugely resisted. Oh my gosh, people just hate calling out CEQA as an issue because it's such a cornerstone of our environmental system, environmental protection values and system. It's also a great tool for what's called green mail, which is threatening or actually filing a CEQA lawsuit means you can't get funding for construction loans or for grants. And so just the act of filing can hold up a project for years, whether your underlying suit has merit or not. So lots of different people use it for reasons other than environmental protection. And all those people want to preserve those rights. But frankly, if we had a housing law that allowed overwhelmingly wealthier, whiter areas to stop apartments, because most of the challenged projects are higher density apartments, and this was in Birmingham or something, we would be at the gates shouting discrimination. And instead, we hide behind the environment, which we also hold as a very, very high value, and just kind of set aside the notion that the people most hurt are younger, browner, and less wealthy. And that, to me, is a sin.
Leslie, let me turn to you. I'm curious, given the title of this panel, the ways in which realtors would define, quote, sustainable housing affordability. And generally, I'm interested in the lens through which the industry sees the state's problems and potential solutions.
Well, I think the quick answer is it's a 6-letter word, supply. And you've already heard that realtors like high housing prices, and I wouldn't totally disagree with that. But I think the bigger issue is that housing opportunity and the volume, the velocity of transactions in this state has plummeted. You know, baby boomers aren't moving because it simply doesn't pencil out, and youngsters can't get in. So I typically get the question, Leslie, our housing, our tax structure is so progressive, we're losing all the millionaires. I have a client who's gonna move to Florida. And I'm like, well, that's great, but let's look at the data. And what the data say are, we are losing the working class and we are losing the millennials, and the California bloom is off the rose. We are not the only game in town, and we have great weather, but so what? Literally took me 2.5 hours this morning to drive from Pasadena to Malibu. And I know better. I should have come last night. I can't. I have a life. I should have left at 6 a.m. I wanted to work out. So there you are, you know, 2.5 hours. So I really have a tremendous amount of empathy for people that don't want more development. But earlier this year, our researcher, the CCRE, we had this wonderful event, and Senator Wiener was there, and he said, you know, I live in a 55-unit condo in the Castro in San Francisco by a BART station, and if it were torn down and rebuilt today, we could rebuild 3 units. I mean, that's a problem, and you know, I want to talk about lowering the bar to having accountability for a housing element. Like, we're not starting from scratch here. We have housing elements.
Can you explain what one of those?
Well, every municipality has to say how many housing units they're going to bring online over a certain period of time, and it has to be approved, and it has to go to the state, and there it is. And they get ignored. There's no teeth in it. You know, there's no repercussions for not delivering on your housing element. So, you know, I say either do it or don't. But you know, right now they're pretty much empty promises. I think the other thing about like a conference like this is I hope there are private sector entities in the room that employ people. You know, what Microsoft did in Seattle was like awesome, and we need to get them involved. This is not going to be solved by government, and it's not going to be solved out of Sacramento, because I couldn't agree more. It's a local issue. There is not a housing problem. There are hundreds and thousands of housing problems, right? And they're all local. But we have to find a way to kind of rethink this. And I have gotten somewhat, you know, I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and I was asked by someone from the League of Cities, how does CAR feel about local control? And being at the no filter part of my career, I said local control is killing us. And I was like, oh my God, front page of somewhere, right? And so I called my boss and our chief lobbyist. I said, what should I have said? And they said, well, you're actually, you know, what you should have said is we are very supportive of local control, but we also feel that the housing elements should be actionable. So I just kind of came back to local control is killing us. And once you started to have these neighborhood councils that will kill anything, I mean, when I look at the tweets coming out of Silicon Valley with Laura and Kim and everything, where it's just a 300-unit senior development, and everyone hates it. You know, it's really, really tough. So I'm so happy to be here. I just want you to know the realtors, like, we're not the bad guys. Like, we want more housing. We want housing opportunity. And one last thing that I'm so proud of is that we are in Koreatown. We are at 6th and Virgil, 6th and Virgil, right by that Carl's Jr. It's incredible. And we need to redo our building because it's kind of a Mad Men 1960s building. And what we want to do is build affordable rental housing, affordable ownership housing, and a much smaller headquarters for CAR. And the original plans are like so beautiful. You know, we've even got this glass conference room on top, and you can see the Hollywood sign. Here's the problem. It's really hard to make it pencil out, and lenders don't know what to do with it because they've never done anything like that before. You don't do affordable rental, affordable ownership, and a headquarters. So we've really got to get more more creative. And I think we have to quit waiting for government to do it, right? It's really we've got to get the people creating the jobs engaged. And if I get the numbers right, from 2010 to 2017, LA County created, 383,000 jobs and some miserable number of housing units, right? And that's true throughout the state, right? The jobs housing imbalance. So I'll tell you what's going to happen. The American Community Survey is very clear. The acceleration of people moving out of this state is going to grow. It's going to get faster because you know what? There are other nice places to live that have cool coffee shops and great things to do where people can actually buy a home and raise a family. And it's not California anymore.
So you just referenced stop waiting for government to do it. Government ultimately, at the end of the day, is the one that approves all these individual projects, right? So what could government at the local and state and regional level be doing differently in California to solve some of these?
Well, I think all the people on the do not benefit from high housing prices column, and I think it's bigger than just two groups, need to get organized and vocal and show up and support people like Jennifer and the people that are activists, because I think it's kind of guerrilla warfare at this point. Now, we are doing all of the legislative stuff in Sacramento. You know, for 5 years, we've been pounding the ADU drum. You know, I mean, there's just so many legislative fixes and things that we can do. But at the local level, as someone said, it's death by 1,000 cuts. So you really have to get activists engaged and showing up to fight for it. And I'm just listening to this book on economics called Misbehaving, and you know, he's talking about, you know, for any given person, loss is much more acutely felt than a gain, you know. So the people that see growth, and I think it was in the earlier presentation as a negative, growth as a negative, they're going to dominate every time because they're the ones who feel it. So we got to figure out a way to mobilize the people that have no voice and no home.
Anyone else would like to weigh in on things that local, state, regional government can and should be doing differently?
Well, I'll add one to a point Leslie made around the housing elements. So this is the regional housing needs assessment that every jurisdiction is given a target number of houses they need to build for each income category. You mentioned that it's a bit toothless, which I think is a fair statement, given that there is really no repercussion, except potentially a lawsuit that states have started experimenting with filing. The two pieces of that is, first, how are those numbers calculated, right? So I think there's a big question. Certainly one of the reasons why we produced our report is because we didn't think there was a great metric to measure what the real need was. And so there's some questions around how the housing elements are calculated down to the jurisdiction level, where you see some jurisdictions actually coming up with 0 new units required for
Can I
development.
cut in quickly on this? So that there's sort of this poster child. It's just like a black boxy sort of thing that happens at the state, where every 8 years they have to sort of produce new housing plans that would match up with projected growth. Sort of a common whipping boy for this is the city of Beverly Hills.
Right.
Total over an 8-year period, their housing production target, both low income and market rate, was 3, right? Which is nuts for an area that is as high income as it is, right? And so you have other areas, the city of Irvine, I believe, I don't have their exact number off the top of my head, but they have a gigantic number in the thousands compared to reasonably other sized cities near them have much lower numbers.
Yeah. But I mean, that's a trend across the state. If you look at every jurisdiction in California and you compare the number of units that they've approved in this 8-year planning period versus the number that they have committed to approve through the RENA process, it's about 24% of the 100% target have been approved on a scale basis. So this is a very common trend. And it's problematic twofold because we don't think the targets are high enough in a lot of cases, and secondly, there are no teeth. So just going back to something Chuck mentioned, which is I think a great point, that every community needs to change to some extent. How do we empower the changers? This is a collective action problem that is pretty clear to everyone that we need to act collectively, and if we empower the individuals over the collective, we're going to have these outcomes that are, collectively suboptimal.
So I'll just weigh in with a couple quick points. One is the legislature recognized the severity of the housing crisis in 1982 when it adopted laws like the Housing Accountability Act, Permit Streamlining Act, which gave local governments exactly 1 year to decide whether to approve housing or not that complied with zoning and general plans. And if the decision was not made to approve, then they were deemed approved. And it was a pretty strong law. It was ultimately gutted by CEQA, but it was both of those acts, without going into detail, were designed to accelerate the required process and reduce an ability by local government to say no to housing that met local standards for zoning and general plans. So it wasn't trying to, those laws weren't trying to gut local control, but they were trying to say, okay, you got it, now you got to approve what you say you want, including housing element law. We could do far worse than to put teeth back into those laws. And there's already teeth been put back into Housing Accountability Act law, which we use now to enforce. There's new laws like SB 35 that Scott Wiener put in place a couple years ago that has some effectiveness. But they're one-off, very legalistic approaches. Permit Streamlining Act teeth would be much more effective, but would have to take on CEQA itself. So that's a kind of cluster of stuff. But I think the other issue is small d democracy, is people hate being caught in traffic. And until we get real about solving transportation, willingness of people, voters, to accept huge amounts of density are going to continue to be pretty constrained. And unless we start saying we don't care about small d democracy, we're going to kind of trump it because of climate change or whatever. Think about the irony of trumping local control because of climate change. I love that. But I think that it's, the political viability of running head-on into the face of that many voters is pretty limited. And I think the governor's already finding that out and is backing away from some of his earlier commitments as now aspirational at best, whatever. But I think transportation solutions have to be in the mix, and they have to work. They can't just theoretically work. And I've got other thoughts on that, but those are the two things.
Well, let me just stick there for a moment, because if this is not a conflict, then forgive me and tell me why I'm wrong. But on the one hand, I'm hearing you saying we need to reform all of these state laws such that developments can get approved more quickly, or more certainly, or all those sorts of things. On the other hand, it sounded like you were saying, well, the transit has to come first, because if it doesn't, then people are not going to accept large amounts of growth, sort of the small d democracy point. Right. So do you see that in conflict, or help me understand?
Sure. So I don't see them in conflict. I think the big revelation in my agedness is that most solutions are and, right? It's not an or. So we need to be serious about solving transportation, and it's not the case that 60-year-olds are going to ride scooters, or that families are going to get on 2 buses to get their kid to school before then getting on 3 more buses to get to work. Those are not viable, practical transportation solutions. And the transportation industry, which is mostly public sector, needs to recognize the role of the private sector, Uber, Lyft, which revolutionized things overnight. That world has to come into the housing world in a more integrated way and be on a track toward making life better. As voters keep saying, make life better, I'll give you some more tax, but make my life better. At the same time that we get serious, and at least the tools I've identified, preserve local control on the small scale, but accelerate production by stopping the delays.
I mean, I think all of these are great ideas. I think there's a more fundamental issue, which is that we have to stop framing change as bad.
Yeah.
And I went to a community plan meeting in Woodland Hills for they're doing their plan update, and literally the planning department came in and said, our goal here is to try to ensure that everything that you love about your community and that everything in your community stays the same. Literally. That's the planning department there, and this local city councilor was there, and they did this whole round table around each of the different tables, and then they came back up at the end and they said, well, what I hear is that you don't want anything to change, and there was a standing ovation, and it was like, so we're not going to address any of these issues if change is always framed as bad. And the reason why we, at least in the city of Los Angeles, why we've downsoned it comes really from the environmental movement, really, which is this idea that, we have limits of growth and, we want to control population growth. And if we allow, liberalize zoning, then that's going to stimulate more growth, and we don't want more growth. But, when's the last time when you thought about, if you're going to have a kid, you check the local zoning ordinance first to see whether there's enough zoning capacity, right? I mean, it's kind of an absurd connection that we need to downzone in order to stop population growth. So I think that we need to start framing these discussions at the local level about outcomes, about what you want your community to be like. Nobody is standing up there saying, I like, having to get in my car and sit in traffic all day. But you start talking about, the kind of qualities you want your community to have, then you can start to focus on some of the reasons why we end up in the place we do. So I think it's really about accepting that change is going to happen, and it's about really trying to shift where that change goes rather than fight the fact that change is going to happen.
Well, and on the point of change, there are things that are in your control. There are certainly things that are out of your control. I think what you're saying is population growth, to a large extent, is out of your control in cities, and therefore you can't put your head in the sand and fight against it. Jobs, as we know, are moving to cities. People need to follow those jobs, and that's what's driving this sort of densification of population. We can't hope that those jobs will move to low-density rural regions where it's easy to build lots of new units, because that's out of our control.
But I think I agree, but I go back to Chuck's point that there's a kind of level of cognitive dissonance that allows the continuation of what is happening to keep going. And by that I mean it's incompatible to hold the view that you need to protect the environment on the one hand and stop more compact, walkable urbanism. Those two things are really quite incompatible. And even our state level environmental organizations are ambivalent on this question, right? And so that's why we need to think about, connecting the conversations across, these two different things. In order to get people out of their cars, to enable more walking, biking, transit, all of these things, there's certain attributes that are required for those things to actually work. There has to be a there. There has to be enough density and enough urbanism for that to function. But what we have is a system where CEQA punishes that very thing that we're trying to create that would actually have positive outcomes. And so you can't on the one hand say, oh, I'm an environmentalist, I believe in protecting the environment, but then go out and protest the housing development that's happening in your neighborhood. Those things are really tough to reconcile, but it's what's happening.
Yeah, and I think that's the infill debate in a nutshell. But another point you make that I don't want to lose is high-density units are much more expensive to build, and they're much less affordable for even union-based workers. There's a new report out by John Husing, who's an economist in Southern California, that chronicles just how poor union-scale construction workers fare in today's housing market in the Bay Area and Southern California. And they have to drive till they qualify to places in the Inland Empire or the more exurban areas of the Bay Area, especially if they want to do home ownership. And home ownership has sort of been an economic stalwart for America since really before the Depression. It was one of the ways the federal government decided to fight communism was to support home ownership. And there's all kinds of indicators about how home ownership results in better educational outcome and more stability and, you know, better health outcomes and greater voter participation. There's all this stuff. And I have to point out that 5% of California is urbanized. 5. And at a 3.5 million home shortfall, now is the moment that we decide the absolute lowest levels of minority home ownership since civil rights laws took effect are permanent because the only thing we're willing to build is high density rental housing? Really? 5% is our cap? Who said that? Who voted for that? It's climate policy? Really? Well, actually, it's less than 1% of California's 1% of greenhouse gas emissions, based on a Turner Center report that came out of UC Berkeley, to never build an affordable home ownership duplex in a suburb again. Really? That's nonsense. So I think we have to continue, hopefully we can all continue with this notion of and, right? There needs to be multiple solutions to the housing crisis, and throwing home ownership opportunities out the window for people who have now 2 working class jobs and are making 6-figure incomes is not acceptable social policy. It's not acceptable civil rights policy. And it's not going to be solved by government subsidizing units that cost $850,000 to produce because they're in towers that currently house fewer than 1% of California's population because they're so expensive. So we need to not embrace a one-size-fits-all solution, please. It's one of my messages.
Yeah.
You know, 20 years ago, John Husing said by 2025, or maybe it was 2020, California will be a majority renter state. And we're already have many cities that are majority renter, and many of them are like in the affordable Central Valley. So this whole thing about affordability, just for a second, is just, it's so relative, you know, and what we see when we look at the migration data is that Bay Area people are being pushed out to Sacramento and Stanislaus counties, and the people in Sacramento are being pushed out of state, right? And the same thing has happened in the Inland Empire, right? The coastal SoCal people are going to the Inland Empire, and the Inland Empire people are going to, a few of them are going to Bakersfield, but most of them are going to Arizona and Texas and areas that have a much higher unit per population change than we do in California. And I think there's some really serious repercussions for that, including this whole wealth building thing. And there was someone tweeted the other day that was like a sucker punch for me, and it was something like, you know, equity growth for the boomers is, you know, poverty for the, I can't remember how they said it very eloquently, but it was kind of like you've got equity growth and the boomers are all patting themselves on the back for being long-term homeowners and they were so smart and look at this, but who's paying the price? You know, it's their kids who are paying the price, and that's just, I just wonder about the social fabric of California with the haves and the have-nots, and when it comes down to something that could really energize people, clearly where you live and how much money you have and what your commute looks like, you know, where's the breaking point for that? You know, it's a little bit scary.
So leads nicely in the question I want to make sure that we talk about, which is how do you define sustainable growth when it comes to preventing gentrification, displacement in communities that have been pressured by the state's housing problems?
Can I actually just respond to the
Mhm.
point of that? Because I think it's a really good point about the transfer of wealth that takes place when you've got these rising housing prices. That slide that Chuck put up that had the sort of the stakeholder list, who is pro-rising housing costs and who is against it. For me, there's a real, that slide shows the transfer of wealth pretty clearly.
Right.
And part of the analysis that we had done in that Closing the California Housing Gap was to look at what is the economic impact on the GDP of the state of that transfer of wealth. And the way we got at that was by looking at what people do with that wealth. So you've got renters, low-income homeowners who are transferring a huge portion of their income, 30, 40, 50% of their income, to the holders of the capital, those who own the land, those who finance the mortgage. What do the holders of the capital do with that income? Well, they tend to squirrel it away. we know that circulation of income is much greater at the lower end of the income spectrum. So the billions of dollars that get transferred from that one pocket to the other pocket in the state actually results in a lot less economic activity. If those low-income families had kept a larger portion of their take-home income, they'd be spending more on local businesses, and that money would get circulated in the economy. Instead, there's a huge transfer of wealth to people who aren't spending. And the impact, I don't know the number offhand, but it was tens of billions of dollars of economic activity could be added to the economy just by closing the housing gap. So affordability is actually a real driver of economic productivity.
Does anyone want to address the displacement question?
I think it was, I know I finished it in November of 2017, an article in the Hastings Environmental Law Journal that was, I think, among the earlier of the articles that actually showed displacement, just by the genius of, a census data report from 2000 to 2010, which showed African American diaspora into exurban areas, into the Central Valley, from places like Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco. And the church guys knew about it soonest because they lost their members and their kids. But we ignored all that because we were all into transit-oriented, high-density, hip, cool development. And I think it's now been pretty well established that that form of development does create new housing units, no question. And people who live in those housing units don't do 2-hour commutes because that's, that's the trade. But the people who are displaced were much more likely to ride the bus because they couldn't afford a new $1 million condo or $400,000 a month rent for a new apartment in those areas. And they're moved out to places that don't have effective transit solutions. So the net result, not intended, has been both a racial diaspora and then a net substantial increase in miles driven and emissions from miles driven. And I think that is an example of what happens when government gets too enthusiastic about itself and starts saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to spend billions and billions on fixed rail transit systems, light rail, metro, even in San Francisco. And we've now seen a substantial decline in those ridership numbers, certainly way less than what we anticipated. And to pay for that, we're going to cut back on more intense and localized bus services in existing low-income neighborhoods, which, by the way, we're also displacing. So we're also killing bus ridership, which is dying all over the country. None of that was intended by the people who were saying transit-oriented development, but it is a consequence. Much more expensive housing is new housing at high density. Affordable housing moves further and further away. Transit solutions are more and more dependent on cars. So I think we need to own. Bill Clinton said in August, before the debacle of the 2016 election, sorry for showing my Berkeley Democratic roots, Bill Clinton said to a group of people in Sacramento that neither party anticipated what globalization would do to the American workforce. And both parties had to own the mistake. I think neither party, but in this state, it's one party that is leading the way, anticipated how environmental law, climate change sort of dogma would result in racial diaspora and discrimination and end home ownership opportunities virtually for normal working families and push them into much higher greenhouse gas per capita states and deprive those who stay behind of a wealth gap, which the feds estimate homeowners have a net wealth that's between 35 and 47% or times higher than renters, times. I mean, it's home ownership that has supported people in retirement, that has made college loans possible. It's unbelievable. So none of that was intended by environmental law or climate policymakers, but it's where we are. And the first step is acknowledging it.
Yeah, I mean, the emphasis on making a very small portion of our cities take all of the growth of the cities through high density transit-oriented developments is clearly having a very perverse effect. We just did a measured JJJ study, and what it showed was
This is a measure in LA that passed a few years ago that aims to incentivize development around transit cars.
well, it does two things.
Yeah.
It for areas that outside of transit areas, essentially puts in place inclusionary housing policy and prevailing wage, but the antidote, so to speak, of that was to create super high incentive density bonuses, essentially right next to transit areas. And what we found is that essentially we're getting more set-aside units, affordable units, but we're getting less units total as a result. And so what we're doing is we're trading off a generalized affordability or